Hey Tony, it's Saturday, and first off, to answer your question of the week, what were some of my hopes for 2021? Not freaking this. So, I'm sure you saw the news this week. I'm sure everyone saw the news this week. But on Wednesday, January 6th of 2021, a group of domestic terrorists stormed the Capitol building, and a Confederate flag flew in the US Capitol for the first time ever. That was what I saw on Wednesday in the early afternoon, and it's kind of interesting to see how much a year can change in just a couple hours. So I kind of scoffed a bit when I saw your video earlier today because you had hopes for 2021, and I understand that I had hopes as well, but Wednesday changed all of that. So for a brief recap, there were a pro-Trump mob of domestic terrorists committed an armed insurrection against the United States, stormed the Capitol building, while Congress were totaling the ballots for Joe Biden to be our next president. And this was the first time the nation's capital has ever been attacked by a hostile force since 1814, when the British burned the Capitol to the ground.
It was the Canadians.
It was the Canadians, not the English.
Yeah, but they were working with the British.
It was with the Canadians.
Always watch out for those moves.
Regardless, it was the British Empire, because Canada was part of the British Empire at that point.
Yeah.
But that was over 200 years ago, and it was a sad day for America, for the world, for everything, when domestic terrorists, and I'm calling them what they are. They weren't a mob, they weren't a militia, they weren't protesters, they weren't patriots, they were terrorists. They, unable to accept the results of a democratically elected election, fueled on by flaming calls by their dear leader that it was all a fraud, that the government was trying to overthrow him, they staged a coup on American soil. While Congress was totaling the ballots on what was traditionally just a ceremonial event, a real celebration of democracy, that was all torn away in an instant. There's obviously a lot to unpack about this, and even several days later, I still don't know exactly what to say. I don't exactly know what to think, because this is something that, as cliche as it sounds, is unprecedented in American history. There have been coup attempts in the past, namely in the during the Reconstruction era South, in which the only other coup that took place on American soil that we have good records for was one of the southern states had elected, I think it was one of the counties, elected several African American legislatures, and the white former slave owners couldn't have any of it, so they stormed that Capitol building. They overthrew that government and killed many people. And it's unprecedented completely. This is not what America stands for. This is not what democracy is supposed to be. Now, there has already been considerable fallout from the events, but I just want to briefly talk about some of what happened from my admittedly biased view. Now, I know my views are not going to be the same as everyone. I am an attorney in urban Massachusetts, but I don't care who you are or where you come from. This was an attack on democracy itself. The Capitol building is more than just a building. It's more than just the place where business is decided, where votes are cast. It's a symbol of democracy. It is a symbol of America. And it is a symbol of our Constitution. The founding fathers were great and complicated men, but this was never what they envisioned. They wanted America to be that shining city on the hill, to be that democracy. Now, America was not the first democracy in the world, but we have been the longest living so far. Until Wednesday. Now, democracy in theory still exists in America, but from my experiences, what I was witnessing was the fall of democracy in America. This was an armed coup by people who could not accept the results of an election. And President Trump added so much fuel to that fire. He has been claiming for months, even months before the election, that, oh, there's going to be a fraud, all these mail-in ballots are going to lead to fraud. Now, there's been no reports of widespread fraud. There's been no evidence of it. Dozens and dozens and dozens of cases have been thrown out by Trump-appointed justices and judges because there is no evidence of fraud. There have certainly been irregularities, and that happens in every election, which is absolutely an issue. But there's been no fraud. The fact that our president, the person who's supposed to lead the oldest democracy currently alive, is supposed to be the one who speaks for us as a country. And that just hasn't happened. For months, we've been hearing this fraud, and even after the election, after all those lawsuits have been thrown out and Trump lawyers have been unwilling to admit to fraud in court because they could lose their licenses because of it, because it has been no fraud. That didn't stop our president. While Congress was meeting to go to certify the Electoral College, there was going to be debate there. Which was irregular, and it was people like Senator Hawley, Senator Cruz, and Senator John Kennedy, no relation to the Massachusetts Kennedy name, as far as I'm aware. They were the ones who were trying to say, oh no, there might have been fraud. And they weren't doing this because they believed it. That's been abundantly clear. They were doing this to score political points. And you had people like soon-to-be Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell come out and say, what's the worst that can happen if we humor him for a few months while he goes through these cases? Well, this is what happens. This is when democracy dies. Now, this is all just a lead up. I haven't even gotten to the point there, and again, I'm very emotional because this is not something that's supposed to happen. We have these traditions, we have these norms, we have this incredible democracy that people just didn't care about then because they cared far more about their leader than they cared about the country. And there were politicians who cared far more about their party than they cared about their country. Which again leads us to early in the morning of Wednesday. There was going to be protests there, that was already understood. And President Trump himself spoke early in the morning, as did his lead counsel Rudy Giuliani. And President Trump said, we will never concede. We need to show how strong we are because we do not want to allow this great election to be stolen from us. Which I'm not going to get into the legalities of incitement, but there's a case that he incited this attack. And Rudy Giuliani, when he spoke, said that we need to make a trial by combat against the people in Congress, which, again, I'm not going to get into incitement, but that leads a lot of evidence to this was a planned event.
Yeah, it's also known as a planned event.
Yeah, well, I mean, like planned by the government.
Oh, yeah.
Like planned by the Trump administration to make it so as their last breath to try and keep hold of power the best they can. And these rioters, they were protesters at this point. But these protesters marched on the Capitol and started practicing their rights on the grounds. They have constitutional rights to peaceful protest. That is absolutely true. What they don't have the right to do, which we saw a little bit later, was commit an armed attack against the symbol of American democracy. Now, there's still... there's still a lot of information that we don't know about yet, but here are some things that we do know. There have been, at this point, I believe 4 reported deaths, 4 or 5. I think it's 5 now, actually. Is it 4?
Still four.
There have been 4. There have been 4 deaths. One of which was a Capitol Police officer who was killed by this insurrection, and the other 3 were in this group of armed insurrectionists. Now, one of them, best as we can tell, was shot by her own people, and no one knew what was going on. Again, this is still a lot of information that we don't know about yet, but that happened, and then we had 2 other people who dealt with the reports I read were just medical complications that occurred during this attack. But the government police, the Capitol Police, the National Guard were not prepared for this. The Capitol Police had a skeleton crew of people there. When you can compare it to images from the Black Lives Matter protests at the Lincoln Memorial, where there were full National Guard and in full Army gear, this was a handful of Capitol Police who were, quite frankly, overwhelmed, and there have even been some videos of them opening up barriers for these terrorists to come in. There were at least 2 incendiary devices that were found that were known to belong to the terrorists. And you can see other images. Many of these men and women, when it walked into the Capitol building, armed, which is a federal crime. They were looking to take hostages. They were looking to attack. They were looking to overthrow the government, to put their person in charge. And then afterwards, because this was all coming in, I was at work and my eyes were glued to the news for hours afterwards. And then when I was on my way home, President Trump released his statement involving the attack. He said, "You're special." He kept arguing these baseless cries of voter fraud. He said, "I love you. You're special. Go home." And then even went so far as like, "You're good people. May those people don't do anything. Don't be violent because you fall right into those other people's hands." That is not a condemnation in any way, shape, or form of what is objectively a terrorist attack. That is saying that I support you. Now, those remarks got universal shame, true shame, from Democrats, from Republicans, from independents, from most people in the country, except for those supporters who thought that what those terrorists were doing was patriotic. It's not patriotic. It's terrorism. It's an armed insurrection. It is something that that's not about our country. We are a democracy. We support the rule of law. We support democratic elections. Because when you don't, you really don't have anything left anymore. And this was all shown in plain view. And there's so many other things that were shown that were just are a real black stain on America completely. For one, the fact that the National Guard were given different orders to not even be there when this was a known thing that was going to happen. There was going to be an attack. Not so much an attack, but there was going to be protests. There were going to be people all over the place. And the National Guard were given different orders. The Capitol Guard were pretty late to the party. Virginia National Guard got there before, as did other states. Now, we don't fully know yet, but the current belief is that the Joint Chiefs of Staffs, which are direct underlings to the Commander-in-Chief, were told to put their people in different areas. And then Donald Trump, who has the power to mobilize the Guard, didn't. Even when the Capitol was attacked and these terrorists were walking around looting things, breaking all sorts, not even just taboos and not even just property around it, but breaking the very image of our secure democracy. And the National Guard were given orders to not be there. Again, much of this is going to be, we're going to learn a lot more as the days, months, weeks, and months go by. But at this point, it's a disgrace. Truly a disgrace. Now, there have been other things that have been brought up, namely the way the Capitol Police acted to these armed terrorists. that you can look over the summer, any of the racial protests, when police were called, they used generally less than lethal force, but they would tear gas people, they would fire rubber bullets incorrectly, they would do whatever they could to harm people who were peacefully protesting against police brutality. But when an armed enemy comes into your Capitol building, they were taking selfies with them. There were certainly some instances of tear gas. There were certainly some instances of not police brutality in any way, shape, or form, but there have been instances of force used by the police to help quell these terrorists, but it was minuscule compared to how it was over the summer. And that just shows that there are two Americas. And this is going to haunt us for years and years and years. And I'm 28 years old. I have lived through at least 3 incredible historical events that were terrible. And I can only imagine how many more we're going to get. But this, to me, is even larger in my view than the 9/11 attacks, or even in no small part the COVID pandemic, because this was an armed attack on American soil. There were Nazi iron crosses put around the Capitol building. As I mentioned before, the Confederate flag was waved through the Capitol for the first time in its history. And there was one other thing that I think stands out even more. One of these terrorists tore down the American flag, threw it on the ground, and put up a Trump-Pence flag. Tony, my question for you is, what were some of your experiences when you were watching this? Tony, I'll see you on Monday.